CASA speaker series on racial and healing justice. And for those of you who don't know, CASA is the program that I direct in part of Pitzer, which stands for Critical Action and Social Advocacy. CASA is actually a community center in Ontario that houses social justice organizing and events, as well as organizations in the area who need office space. Normally our classes are held there this semester, and half of last semester were held online instead. But CASA is also an academic program. So all the students in this class take 2 classes, a research methods class, so they can learn about how to do research in ways that are connected to and driven by our local communities. Can you all hear me? Is everything good? Okay, just making sure. And also a second class, which is critical community studies, where students learn about local community issues that affect this area and are also global issues related to immigration, incarceration, education, food justice, labor, arts, and health. And so this semester, I thought, what a fun way to make it more interactive for the students, since they don't get to engage with our community partners in person, we will bring the community partners to them through a speaker series. So nearly every Tuesday, we're going to have a different community leader share with students their approaches and theories of social change, and also in particular about how racial justice and healing justice impact the work and are informed by the work. So since we're having all these other folks come speak to the class, I thought I should participate as well, so my students know where I'm coming from. So this week they read my book, and I'm giving this first lecture as the launching of our speaker series to involve myself in it as well as a participant in this work. And the work I'm going to share with you all today is based primarily on my book, and it is also based on the last 20 years of my work involved in community-based organizations. I worked with civil rights organizations and organizations working on anti-bias education and curriculum for teachers in the region. And I also have been directing community engagement programs and centers for the last 14 years at Pitzer. So that's what this work is based on. And I am excited to share with you the first chapter of my book about sort of the pathways that we can take for creating social change and building community. Usually this is done in a 2 or 3 hour workshop, and it's very interactive. And so I'd have everyone lying on the floor doing a meditation to start. I'd have people doing theater activities and writing activities and meeting in small groups and pairs and all kinds of things. For the purposes of today, given Zoom and that this lecture series is a little bit more traditional in nature, I'm just going to be lecturing to you guys about these ideas, but I hope that you will take the ideas and make them experiential, interactive. So go back home to whoever you're sheltering in place with and spark these dialogues about how this work can be done and how we can transform ourselves and the world. Write about it, do some poetry or some movement that brings these ideas to life. Since we can't do that together, I'm going to charge you with that invitation to bring it to life on your own. And after I speak about the work for the first half hour, the second half hour will be Q&A, questions that the students created, and then some that you all might bring in discussion together afterwards. So that's the lay of the land. I am going to go ahead and start a little presentation that I made. Some people are visual learners, so I tried to put down in writing some of the stuff that I'm doing here. So you'll see that I'm sharing my screen. Everyone should be able to see it. If you can't, let me know. I can't see everyone with a screen like this, so if you have something to say, just unmute yourself and say something. So this is the name of my book, Student Development and Social Justice, Critical Learning, Radical Healing, and Community Engagement. And we're going to be focusing on the first, one of the first chapters, which is Disrupting Injustice and Mobilizing Social Change. So, and away we go. So this is the tree that I use as our description of how we do critical community engagement. And we always start at the root of the matters. And the root of the matter is my gratitude for all of you for being here so that we can create a community in this 1 hour we have together of thinking and sharing ideas about this. And also gratitude to my family, some of whom are here on the call today, who have taught me so much about how to make community and social change. And to my ancestors whose traditions that I inherit, and also to the ancestors of others and the mentors and guides that I've had in my life. that have informed this work. And I carry many ideas and theories from others into this work and sort of cluster them together. So I will be mentioning many different people I'm grateful for whose ideas have informed this work as we go along. The other thing at the root here is this notion of knowing peace and knowing justice. So since the beginning of time, we have had this as a rallying cry at our protests: no peace, no justice. Which is to say, if we don't have justice, we cannot have peace. And without peace, we cannot have justice. And if we do not get the justice we demand and need, we will disrupt the peace in the streets. We need it so much that we are willing to disrupt and bring to light and have our voices heard about how we need justice. And this has carried us farther in social movements than we can imagine. It's made tremendous change in our lives to have protests that demand peace and justice. And I think that is a really important part of our work, but I think there's another part that's also important, which is to know peace and know justice. And by that, I mean, how do we know it in our hearts? How do we know it in our lives? How do we know what peace feels like? We can't demand nonviolence out there on the streets if we are practicing violence within and to our own bodies, right? We need to know what peace looks like in relationship with our own bodies and hearts and minds and spirits, with our families, with our neighbors, and with our communities. So to really know and live and embody peace that we are demanding out in the world, as well as to know justice. And what I mean by that is I really want us to know justice in the sense of understanding root conditions that have led to the justice or injustice of the moment, and understanding our parts where we are complicit in systems of injustice and where we have been targeted or harmed by systems of injustice, and to really understand the dynamics and the conditions and structures of that justice. So to really do our study of justice. So this is at the root of this issue: to know peace and to know justice. That's a premise of my work here. And I'm deeply inspired in this work by the words of Lila Watson and a group of activists she worked with in Australia in the 1970s, to whom this quote is credited, which is, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come here because your liberation is bound up in mine, then let us walk together." So we do not do this work out of charity or pity for those who've been oppressed, or out of the rage that we want to take away the power from the dominators and become dominators ourselves. We do this out of a sense of solidarity, recognizing a deep interconnectedness that we have as humans across this planet and species with other species across this planet, and that our liberations and our oppressions, that our pain and our suffering and our joy and our well-being are bound together, and we impact and inform each other. And that's how we come to this work, as a way to know how deeply we are interconnected. So now I'm going to bring you to this 4-point framework that was created by Bryan Stevenson, who's a wonderful criminal justice activist. Many of you may know him from the movie Just Mercy that just came out about him and his work. But he came out with this 4-point framework, and he shared this many years ago in an auditorium when he came to speak at Pomona College. And I was so impacted by it, and I contacted him and said, can I use this premise you've laid out and sort of adapt it to the work that I'm doing here in the community, because I think it's really helpful. And he said, of course. So that's the premise I'm going to use. And it starts with becoming proximate. So becoming proximate is the first step in this, which is we have to get close and personal to the issues that we want to change in the world and to the communities that are impacted by them. In some instances, this is going to be your own community. You're impacted by something in your own community. There's a social justice issue in your own community that you want to address. And so in some ways, it's sort of becoming proximate to yourself. What is my experience of this thing? How do I know about this thing? What have I learned about it? How have I been socialized around it? What do I understand? What am I bringing to the table? What do I feel and know about this? And how might I be impacted personally and historically? And other times you're not doing it around something that's, you know, an issue of your own community. You're doing something that is in someone else's community, someone else's issue that actually doesn't affect your life personally. And then becoming really conscious of how do you show up to that? How can you show up with humility and curiosity and openness and self-awareness? How can you be accountable to your actions and to what you know and what you don't know and be willing to learn? How can you get connected with a community that may not be yours in a way that's really respectful? Maybe there's a bridge, someone you know in that community that kind of can invite you in to get involved and help educate you and connect you. But how do you do that process of learning about someone else's plight without having your learning occur at their expense? And by that, I mean, sometimes in our ignorance about something, oftentimes our ignorance may be based on fear or misinformation, but we may jump to conclusions or have biases or preconceptions that are really hurtful and harmful to others. So how can we disrupt our own ignorance in a way that doesn't harm others in the process? And this comes to a deeper and bigger conversation of how can we be generous and compassionate to other people when they are in disrupting their ignorance, even when it happens at our own expense, and when can we not? So I'm going to give you a little story here about that, which is when I was in my 20s, I lived in Spain for a year. It was a magnificent year and it changed my life. But I lived in this tiny, tiny little apartment with two other young women. I was 20, they were 25, and we had this little apartment for a year in Madrid. And they, I think one of them had never met an American before, and she had never met a Jew. And I'm a Jew. And she asked me when we first met, "Where are your horns?" I was like, "My horns?" And she had had an education that Jewish people were connected to the devil and had horns. So this is a clearly problematic situation. Now, luckily, I had not faced that much anti-Semitism in my life. And I had the capacity in that moment to take that ignorance and harmful situation and deal with it and explain to her, "No, we don't have horns, you can check." And really give her an education about Judaism and Jewish people. It could be quite possible that had I experienced more anti-Semitism in my life or been in a different mood that day, that I would not have the capacity to negotiate that harm and her ignorance. And that would have been a perfect time for her to instead turn to our other roommate, who was a bit more progressive and sort of worldly, and could have asked her these questions, and her other roommate could have helped educate her. So without putting the labor of education on the person who's been sort of marginalized by the injustice. So there's a lot of ways that we can become proximate and educate ourselves, and we have to be really mindful about how that's happening so we can cause the least harm possible. And also, when we are able to be generous and help educate each other, we can, and other times we have to have other means to really think about how to learn more about a situation, especially if it's not your own. So the premise of becoming proximate is really about this accountability to each other, to do this work with respect, and to gain a sense of agency from becoming closer and deeper involved with an issue that you can make change. And accompaniment is another concept brought to me by my mentors in Peru about really accompanying someone and learning and being a part of a community and see how they would like to be supported by you and build a friendship and connection by which you can begin to see how you could help participate in that community and make change and recognize our interconnectedness. This is a much more sort of stronger and more ethical way than getting involved in a different social justice issue because of feelings of guilt or charity or worse, of voyeurism. In this segment, I've drawn on readings and lessons from Lila Watson, Thich Nhat Hanh, Bell Hooks, Paulo Freire, Joanna Macy, and Pratech, which is the organization in Peru that I was mentored by, and George Lipstitch. Shout out to them. So this is a very long quote, but I think it's really good. So I am going to go ahead and read it to us, which says, "Taking care of those in need is valuable and honorable work, and most people do it with generosity and good intentions. But it also serves to mask the inequitable distribution of jobs, food, housing, and other valuable resources. When temporary shelter becomes a substitute for permanent housing, emergency food a substitute for a decent job, tutoring a substitute for adequate public education or public schools, and free clinics a substitute for universal health care, we have to shift our attention from the redistribution of wealth to the temporary provision of social services that keep people alive. The problem is not with providing social services. Many radical groups, such as the Black Panthers and the Zapatistas, have provided social services as a tool for organizing. The problem comes when we put all of our time and energy diverted towards social services to the detriment of long-term social change. So this is a larger conversation about how do we make social change. But one thing that I want to bring up here is that when we're thinking about these topics, we need to really think about, are we looking at the root conditions of things and trying to change them, or are we just concentrating more on the band-aids and the emergency things that we can do here and now to attend to the suffering? I think both things are supposed to happen. Can you guys see these slides as I move from one to the next? Someone speak up, because I can't see the whole group if you say yes.
It's
Yes.
changing for me, yeah.
Can you see the shifting the paradigm slide now?
No,
Yes.
I can't see, but I'll try leaving the meeting and come back.
Lincoln, can you see the shifting the paradigm slide now?
Yes.
Okay. Z, can you see him? The shifting the paradigm slide?
Yeah. Shifting the
Okay.
paradigm.
Okay, great. Just making sure tech is working. All right. So this last point means, how do we come back to really look at the root conditions of what's going on? And by root conditions, I'm talking about what has led to the circumstance that you want to address. So maybe you're interested in tutoring and mentoring, but why do we need so much tutoring and mentoring? Well, one reason is because our schools are failing us in many ways. Our achievement gap for students of color and white students is just exponentially large. And it's going to get worse during COVID, let me tell you. It's just, the inequities are staggering. So how are we not addressing the real, what's at the crux of what problems we're having to make quality public school education? That's a really important place to start. But also, we have students who are suffering in the here and now. We need to attend to uplifting them through tutoring and mentoring in the here and now, right? So we have to do both things at once. And we hope that we can attend to what's needed in the moment, but also looking at those root conditions. This idea of shifting the paradigm is really beginning to understand the justice issue that you're interested in at another level. So there's this concept from Marx about false consciousness, which means that we have been taught so much about how things are that we begin to believe them ourselves, even if they're not to our benefit to believe them, and they're actually systems working against us. So I'm going to actually, I'm going to stop the screen share for just a second so you guys can see me as I'm talking to you without being distracted by the screen. I'm going to just tell you a little story here about this, which is that I was recently in a conversation with a young 15-year-old woman. She is biracial, Black, multiracial, Black, Native American, white, and Jewish. And we were talking, and she said, you know, I just hate how I look so much. And I said, what do you mean? She said, oh, I just hate, my hair is so curly and my hips are so big and I want to be skinnier and my skin is like too dark. I want it to be lighter. And as she was talking, my heart was breaking because I love her very much. And I hate to hear her talk about herself this way, but also because the systems of racism and sexism that are so powerful in our country had become insipid and integrated into her own thinking, such that her knowledge of herself versus these ideals of beauty and the standards of beauty that we have in our country were coming up against each other. So even though she's been raised with strong women, feminist women in her life, these messages had still inculcated in her system of thinking. And the worst thing is, she said to me next is, the problem is that I have low self-esteem. And I was like, no, the problem is racism and sexism. She made it a personal failing of herself that she felt this way. And I started asking her questions. What do your best friends look like at school? And I know that she goes to school in a different district that's much wealthier and whiter. And she said, well, most of my friends are all skinny and tall and blonde. And I said, uh-huh. And what do you watch on TV? And she said, I watch Friends. And I said, what do you look at in magazines, you know, TV magazines, different things? The magazines, the media, the shows, the movies, her friends, the community, all is projecting this standard of beauty that is unattainable for most people in the country, which is, you know, tall, white, wealthy, blonde, skinny, all these different things. And when she could not meet that standard, then she took it as a personal failing of herself. And it really was eroding her self-confidence. And I started talking to her about these systems and the messages that she had come in and begin to digest in her own self. And talking to her about sexism and racism and how these things exist on these global levels. And really the structures and how they work to socialize us. So much so that we begin to believe those messages. And in that process, theoretically, academically, this is what Paulo Freire would call conscientização, which is a Portuguese word for consciousness raising. She had this consciousness raising moment in that conversation. I could literally see her head like, and the light bulb going off. And she was like, wait, what was that word you just said? Oppressi or something? I was like, oppression? She's like, yeah, oppression. Tell me more about that, right? Trying to understand these different structures that exist that are beyond her own individual life experience, but inform it so much. And she had this consciousness sort of raising moment, and her false consciousness, the false consciousness she had that it was just her problem that she didn't look this way, was beginning to be disrupted. That's an act of decolonization and an act of consciousness raising that is really powerful and necessary, but it's going against just hundreds of years of messaging. Right, and she's 15 years old trying to make sense of this and understand it. That's the beginning of shifting the paradigm and understanding the issue at play. Right, so when I talk about these larger words like decolonization or consciousness raising or false consciousness, I hope you see sort of illustrated through this example what that looks like actually in action, right? And so I'm going to go back to sharing my screen now so you guys can see the presentation again. And we're going to talk about it a little bit more. So exploring the root conditions of injustice and unlearning false consciousness. These are all real things that are really part of shifting the paradigm. Regenerating traditional knowledge, are the knowledge that we know, that we've been taught, that has been silenced in many of our cultures and traditions. These are all parts of shifting the paradigm, shifting the narrative of what we understand about issues of injustice in the world and the messages we've been given. And then ways that we can actually shift it outside of our own selves is to do that publicly. We do that through arts, through protests, through graffiti, through pedagogy, theater of the oppressed, different theatrical and creative ways of demonstrating new ways of seeing the world or different ways of seeing the world. We do that through, like I said, protests or civil disobedience. We do that through perhaps our own mindfulness and contemplative practices, where we begin to see these things outside of ourselves and begin to understand what our own self is and where our strengths are and where we are individually in our love and in our sort of going back to beginner's mind, which is the Buddhists would say this, so that our opening our first beginner's mind of understanding the world before all that socialization came in, before we have all these assumptions and things that we have to break through. Can we come back to what we know and feel inside? And that also happens through healing circles. So I imagine if my 15-year-old friend could go around with 10 other 15-year-olds who are also multiracial and sit together and talk about the experiences they have had, the healing that can come from shared experiences, that can come from connecting and talking about our wounds, that can come from recognizing our assets and move through our vulnerability towards our courage. We also have to do this on the level of our movements, right? So our movements have to transform themselves.
Are you watching it down there, Paula?
Our movements have to transform themselves so that they don't replicate the same sexist, racist, homophobic paradigms that we have all been impacted by, right? So we have to change our movements themselves. And a lot of this happens by shifting our beliefs, habits, and actions, and also practicing self and community care, which we'll talk about a little bit more next here. So I want you all just to take a moment and think about what's a key issue that's connected to you or not connected directly to your life, but that you're interested in around peace or justice or well-being, something that you'd like to explore and change. What do you know about that issue and the community it impacts most? How did you learn it? What are some of the false narratives you might know? Maybe things you need to unlearn about it. What are more things you need to learn or relearn? And how can you do that education and becoming connected and involved with that issue or the community in respectful ways? and learn what are the visions for change that are being mobilized by those most impacted by the issue, so that they're directing and leading the movements, and you can be in solidarity. And if it is something directly connected to you, that you can imagine what you want for the future and map that out and have that as a roadmap for leading movements. And others who may not be a part of it can be in solidarity and join you in that effort. So really just, what do you need to shift and understand differently or better in order to really move authentically and effectively towards working towards change? So this is just something for you to reflect on. Unfortunately, we don't have time to really do a whole activity and debrief around it right now, but I invite you to consider those questions. And if you want more of these questions or to see them later, I can share with you this presentation or the entire chapter of my book that goes into it more. So now when we come into this, we begin to feel really uncomfortable, because shifting our paradigms and our knowledge and our understanding of these things is really hard, and it goes against years of learning and socialization. So it can be really uncomfortable, and we can not want to feel that discomfort. Joanna Macy calls it apatheia, this collective refusal to fully experience the pain of the world, because feeling it will create despair or anger or guilt, or further recognizing the false consciousness that we've been embedded in. And that is really hard. And so we don't often want to feel it. And yet, when we don't, when we don't feel it, we're just pushing away that discomfort. And I love this quote from Beth Barillo. It says, "Discomfort is the safety mechanism for systems of oppression to stay intact. If we don't rock the boat's just going to keep on going." We don't want to feel that discomfort, our rage around these systems, or our guilt for participating in them, or our despair or hopelessness. So we just, you know what, smoke some weed, go shopping, have some dangerous kinds of sex. We just do things that will numb us out, distract us, and so we don't have to feel it. But that just lets it keep going. So we have to be willing to invite in the discomfort, sit with it, get to know it, and make our way through it so we can get towards the sense of agency for making change. So we sit with the discomfort, where either we have been explicitly or implicitly contributing to systems of injustice, or that the discomfort that comes from being harmed by them and really feeling that pain. And we can sit with it by showing up to these kinds of conversations, to the hard conversations you might have with members of your family or your neighbors or people who you don't know, who you disagree with, and really trying to show up present and open and grounded and humble for that conversation, to learn, to reflect on ourselves, again, where we might have biases that are contributing to these systems, but then also where we have wounds that have really resulted from being impacted by these systems. Mindfulness is a way for us to sit with discomfort and really just be with it, and also learn how to gain greater bandwidth for pain, but also for compassion for ourselves and for others. And then beginning to think about, how do we align with others and do things differently? Enact power with rather than power over. And that means like with your own body, in your own relationships, so that we are actually embodying in ourselves and in our families, in our communities, those values for peace and justice and well-being that we want in the world. We have to get uncomfortable to see where we're not doing that and where we can, so that we actually are aware of it and can move towards action. A lot of this work here has been informed for me by Joanna Macy, Sean Jin Wright, Gramsci, Beth Barillo, and Zimmerman. So as I'm talking about this, I want you guys just to stop for a second. If you can, take a deep breath. Maybe consider closing your eyes. And how does this feel? Like, as we're talking about this, how does this land on your body? When we're talking about suffering and injustice, it can feel really constrictive and scary. Sometimes it can feel enlivening, like we can feel things shifting in us. Or it can feel exhausting, like there's so many things to think about and do. Just whatever it is, I just want you to take a moment to just find your breath. And see where this lands. Check in with the sensations that are emerging for you. So as we become proximate to things, we open our eyes and begin to shift our understanding, which creates some agitation and discomfort. But it also brings us and moves us towards action. So this last step is cultivating hope. We must furnish our lives with spaces of hope, as Maya Angelou said, so that we have the resilience and the faith and the chutzpah, the cojones that we need to make the change that is necessary in our world. And when we can find that together, it is so much stronger and we can feel so much more empowered to do this work. So collective hope is when we come together and feel that sense of belonging and purpose and possibility. So going back to the example I gave earlier about the 15-year-old girl who's feeling the effects of racism and sexism and how they think of their body image and their sense of self. If that 15-year-old girl could be with 10 other multiracial girls talking about body and mind and spirit and the messages they've received around race and gender and body image, and begin to have some shared experiences with folks, that you get a sense of belonging, a place where your vulnerability is welcomed and where you can feel the possibilities, and maybe you're not so alone and there's actually things you can do to change that feeling of pain into feelings of agency. And that's where the radical imaginings come in. Where do you imagine a world where everybody is accepted, where everybody feels free and connected and safe and secure? So this key component, there are key components of cultivating hope. Like I mentioned, understanding the root causes of oppression and raising our consciousness around them, recognizing our shared experiences, and then imagining a radical future that embodies that peace and justice and freedom that we want. That literally embodies it. We have to feel it in our bodies through movement, through dance, through yoga, through chanting, through screaming, through hugging. We have to feel that capacity for the peace and joy and freedom. We have to paint it and write it and own it in our own voices. If we only know what we're fighting against, we don't know what we're going towards. And in order to know what we're going towards, we have to have limitless creativity and radical imaginings of what the world could be like. What could the world be like without prisons? Would it mean that every kid had a really nurtured early childhood with good health care and good education and housing, so that we wouldn't actually end up needing those prisons? Right now, the way they determine the number of prison beds that they will need in 20 years is based on the literacy level of third graders. There's a correlation between the literacy level of third graders and crime. So that's how they determine how many prison beds you're going to need. So instead of building more prison beds, why don't we deal with the literacy issue and the healthcare and the education and the housing and the love and support for kids, right? Really coming back to those root conditions. And uplifting the community assets and the resilience and solidarity that we have, and centering our healing around the ancestral traumas of injustice, around our own personal challenges, so that we can provide places where people can be vulnerable and connect and find strength and belonging, and have the energy for doing the work of change and even imagining it, and recognizing and celebrating our belonging and interconnectedness. So those are the pieces, my friends. I'm coming to the end of my lecture time, and we're going to go into some Q&A and conversation together. But just to wrap it up, to leave you with the main points: how we can center healing and racial justice work through social change-based change. And by social change-based, I mean social change at the root of conditions rather than charity work that only addresses the top level. I do think we need charity work to address those who are suffering in the here and now, but I don't think we can leave it at that. I think we really need to go into systems change. Do it with asset-based frameworks, that we're looking at the strengths and assets of communities rather than just seeing the deficits, and making sure that the work we do is community driven rather than driven by outside agendas, and that it's critically conscious, that we're reflecting on our own selves as we participate in it, and collectively reflecting on our groups and our movements as we do the work, and that it's mindful and thoughtful on a variety of different levels. So these are the main points. that's the pathway that took us there, all these different segments of it. If there's anything you missed or didn't understand, this is being recorded, so we can come back and listen to it later, or there's a chapter in the book, then you can read it. And if you have any questions, comments, or protests, of course, you can contact me directly. So that's my spiel. I'm going to leave it there for right now. I have some students who have some questions. They read the chapter in my book about this. They're going to sock it to me so I can see where the gaps are in my research and in my work, and see how we can keep improving together. So some of the students, these are all my students in the class, you can see on the screen, are going to ask some questions, and then we're going to open it up for a general dialogue after that. So thank you everyone for giving me your attention and time while I lectured to you. And now let's bring on who I know, Katie, Ada, and Aditi, you all had questions you wanted to ask. So whoever wants to go first, just hop on in.
I can kick us off. So I remember this has been something that's been on my mind for a while, and I feel like it was touched on a bit in the chapter. And I'm honestly having a bit of trouble vocalizing this question. So I hope I can get it across. But it's essentially like, I'm curious if there are concrete methods to like interrogate your intentions when going into this type of work. Like I sometimes, like when I find myself in like particular situations, I'm constantly questioning like, why am I here? What is my end goal? Like, who am I trying? Like, who is this benefiting? And I feel like I know the right answers, but I struggle sometimes to like, I don't know, just like fully answer that and like feel like secure and ethically correct in my, I don't know. And sometimes I don't know if I'm just like overthinking these things, but I'm wondering if there is like, you know, like a set of questions or like a thought process that others who might have had these questions like kind of take themselves through.
It's a wonderful question, Ada. There's no magic bullet, but there is the act of self-reflection and critical reflection that is going to be the tool to get you there. And I'm so glad you asked that question, because next week you're going to be reading the second chapter, which is on self-awareness. And I actually have a number of questions to ask yourself to interrogate. What are my intentions and my motivations for wanting to do this work? Is it to be applauded, to look good as a good human in the world? Is it to feel better about places where I feel pained? What are my real intentions? What are my real motives? And some real questions that I can ask myself there. So we're going to be reading exactly that, and I have those specific questions in the chapter. But I do think some of it is also doing exactly what you're doing, which is really reflecting on it and trying to ask yourself some hard truths, but also to talk to other people about it. So the first time when I was going to Peru to do some work on indigenous knowledge systems and community building with folks in the Andes, before I went, I wrote to the executive director of the organization that was inviting me in, and I said, I'm so excited to come. I'm really excited to do anything I can do to help. I'm just curious, like what might we be doing together? I have no idea, because I was buying a plane ticket and moving to Peru for the summer, and I had no idea what I was actually going to do with the organization. And the director wrote me back and he said, before you come, we need to establish the terms of this partnership, because in true partnerships, there are no agendas. You're going to come here, and he said, I'll never forget this, vamos a estar unas amistad y ver a lo que el camino indica. We're going to come here and make a friendship together and see what the path indicates. So how could he possibly know what I was going to do or what we could do together until we established a friendship, became proximate and connected, and then together the agenda would emerge based on what is needed in the moment by the community and how my accompaniment could really pan out. So I had to be clear that even then, he said, in true friendships, there is no help. We're here for mutual reciprocity. The notion of help was sort of patronizing a bit. I was coming as a white Westerner to come help support this indigenous group. It was off base to begin with. So I had good intentions, And I thought I was really going to learn and to support. But even in that, I still was so trained by my socialization here that I was like, well, I'm coming to help. I'm a good person doing good work. And he really helped me see the nuance there, that even in that was sort of problematic. And what we really need to do is build a relationship first and then see what could be done. So you can do a lot of critical self-reflection, and other times it needs to happen in community space to really talk together, to become aware of things that we're not even consciously aware of, right? And I do think the meditation and mindfulness practice also helps. And sort of, yeah, checking yourself with other people, having a circle of folks who can help keep you accountable and reflect with you is really helpful. But we will dive into some more concrete questions about that next week. And if anyone on the call is interested in that, I will send you the chapter so you can see what the students and I are going to dive into next week. Aditi, or thank you, Ada. Aditi or Katie, did you want to ask your questions?
Yeah, I can ask my question. So I guess I'll just kind of preface it with saying that it was specifically about this idea of like self-care and inner healing. And I feel like, I'm trying to think of how to properly phrase this, but I feel like a lot of the time this focus and attention on mindfulness sometimes feels like such a privilege. And feels like something that may be exclusively for people who have that privilege of time and self-reflection and are in like a very healthy headspace in order to have it. And I was wondering, for my question, how can we support others in cultivating hope and healing when they're feeling really hopeless and broken? It just has to deal with somebody like specifically in my life right now who's dealing with a lot of like past trauma, specifically like with the police, being unsheltered, different people with, so different relationships in that way. And how can you, as somebody who has the privilege to be mindful and do these kinds of healing practices, how can you inspire hope in others while also acknowledging the fact that not everybody has that privilege or is in the right headspace to be doing so, if that makes sense? Okay.
Yeah, it's a really good, hard question. So I think mindfulness and cultivating hope or joy or space to reflect is available to everyone. And people have been doing these in movements. The most oppressed peoples of the world have been negotiating that since the beginning of time, right? So, and that is in large part how folks get through those times. So in the civil rights movement, you know, music and singing was such a huge part of that movement, to get literally in the face of police brutality and dogs and hoses of water being sprayed at you, to sing your freedom. And that was a practice of deep mindfulness, right? And deep centering and deep finding of faith and joy and strength in a moment of absolute oppression. And that was a tool to survive and face it. So I don't think it's a privilege for those who just have the time and a yoga studio to enjoy it. I think it's available and used by people throughout time. I do think there's a movement right now that's commodifying self-care and making self-care be for wealthy people who can go to a therapist and go to a gym and go to a yoga studio or a yoga retreat. And that's a commodification that happens because of capitalism in this country, that happens to any good movement. So we shouldn't be surprised. But that's also bullshit, right? These things are available to us. And I have been working in the prisons for the last 6 years and having very deep experiences with folks who are utilizing their time inside as a deep meditation practice. And that's the most imprisoned place and the hardest place to practice, because you're living constantly with 300 people up in your face and no quiet. And to be able to zone in and do it there is a real testament to the spirit, but also a tool for survival. And I have been told by many men inside that that's what helps them survive, is their ability to find some sort of mindfulness practice. So the will to be able to do it when you're feeling so low is very hard. And of course, depression and anxiety and trauma can make it feel very, very difficult to pull that. And yet it is a tool that can help navigate oppression and depression and anxiety and trauma so that it doesn't feel like it takes over you so completely. How you can help someone find their way to it, I don't know that you can do that right? I think people really have to come to it on their own accord. But I think you just being a witness to their process and holding space and love for them, and also really letting them know of some tools and some things that might be helpful, can be a lifeline, you know. And Parker Palmer is a beautiful writer who talks about these issues, and he suffers with depression. And he said, I had so many people who came in the depth of my depression, and, you know, Parker, it's beautiful outside. Come take a walk with me. We can meditate in the sun. Or Parker, you should read this. This is so good. And like a lot of people, good intentions to try to help someone pull through and find these tools to be amazing. And none of it all just felt so hard and almost like judging him, like he couldn't do that. It felt bad, worse. And he said the one friend that really helped him in that time would come every afternoon at 4:00 and come in and wash his feet. And they wouldn't say a word. And he held his feet and washed them. And the tenderness of being cared for and held, and it was a space where he felt like he could really break down, but also really feel a little bit of that love, and maybe in that a little bit of hopefulness. That was a way to be mindfully meditative together without calling it that and without pushing it on him, but just creating a space. So I think about that a lot. And I think your question is a really big one. And I think right now part of what we're trying to do is like decolonize self-care from it being this thing that is just for richer white people to be able to enjoy because they have the funds to, and really recognizing that it's something that communities have been doing since the beginning of time to survive and thrive, and that it's available to all. And people will come to it and into it in the ways that are culturally appropriate for them and when they're able to. It's a very big, long question. I don't feel like I'm going to be able to do justice to it now, but we will actually, again, the next chapter talks about self-awareness and healing practices for self and community. So we're going to get into that also a lot more in the next chapter. Such a good question. Aditi, do you want to do the final one?
Yeah, I guess kind of in tangent with what Katie's question was, kind of being like a good accompaniment, like a good ally, and being there for a friend. I think part of that work, also what you were talking about, was also like taking down these like huge dominant forces, and that requires a lot of reconciliation that people instantly respond with through shame. So how can you, not necessarily like an enemy, but someone who isn't really ready to embrace that humility, that there are grievances for other communities and other lived experiences, who is not really ready to be an ally yet, and is like having trouble like reaching that stage because I think they see it as like a loss of honor. Like, how can you kind of like, I don't know, bring them over to the other side? If that makes any sense.
Yeah, I sort of keep coming back. I don't know that you can make anyone do anything, whether it's meditate or be a good ally. I think you can furnish them with some place to listen to what their real experience. Why does that feel like it would be a loss of honor to you? What is it? And sometimes when we're also sort of awakening to the things that we're coming to, we don't really have capacity to go be an ally for someone else, because we're right now just needing to be an ally for our own pain and what we're going through. And sometimes we feel guilt about something else, and that stops us from being able to go over and to be an ally. I think we have to sort of negotiate that discomfort, whatever those feelings are, and really sit with them and work through them to get to that other side. I don't think you can rush past it. I think part of that resistance is the work. That resistance, what comes up for you, the fighting, the discomfort, that's part of it, is the work. And if you don't get through that, you won't be a good ally anyways, because you'll start projecting that stuff out sideways. So I think you kind of have to let people make their way through their own process of self-awareness and self-reflection, and deal with whatever's coming up. I've been working on racial justice issues for 25 years, and I work with a lot of white people, and there's a lot of resistance of white folks because it feels so shaming that we have done and participated in a system that is so egregious, that to admit it and then to be an ally is like too much cognitive dissonance. But I'm a good person and I didn't try to do anything. These are my ancestors. Like, well, no, it is you, and it is now, and it's still happening now. And we're all part of it. that's too hard for people to sit with, and you have to really help them wrestle and listen to it, what they're going through, and help talk and think about what's going on. And then also, usually you might be feeling really pained in one way and oppressed in one way, or really well educated about one thing, but there's something else that you haven't considered or you don't know about. So there's so many different entries into the conversation of ability, disability, thinking about incarceration, non-incarceration, thinking about race, thinking about gender, thinking about sexual orientation. There's so many different issues wherein you might have some power or you may not have some, where you have been harmed by systems or you have been complicit in them, and really trying to understand the ways in which we all operate in a variety of different levels, and have places where we can recognize our privilege and become allies, and places where we can recognize maybe the pain that we've experienced and really process that and think where we need solidarity from others. So there's a lot of that self-reflection work that I think has to happen before you can move through it and then be effective. I'm cognizant of time. We don't have too much time left, so I'm going to leave it at that for right now, and I'll open it up to anybody else from our guests who are on the call, or anyone else in the class who would like to ask a question or just share a reflection or your own thoughts, or if you have a better answer to any of the questions that came up, please do share them. This is a collective experience here. So if you have a question or comment, unmute yourself and unvideo yourself, or put on your video and just go ahead. Anybody is open to everyone.
So I have a question, Tessa.
Yeah.
Something that I came across in the reading that I wanted to talk more about, or just because I think I don't know, it really interests me, like the story about when you talked about how these students who are part of the Inside Out program had this conversation where one of the other participants or students who was inside said that they don't feel oppressed, and that and then the students made this argument later that he or they were still living under this false consciousness. But then there's this argument that what right do you have to say that somebody's living in that the reality is not real, and that you have more capability to I don't know, have a realistic consciousness. I don't really know the right language to use, but so, I mean, that struck a chord with me in that, how do you do that conscious raising? And is it kind of this dance where you don't want to totally I don't know, disregard the experiences of this person, but at the same time you want to open them up to new perspectives. So it was I didn't know, I read that and I was damn, I don't know what to do with that. And so I was just curious I don't know. I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, you pinpointed a very difficult dynamic, which I think it can be very patronizing for someone else to come in and tell someone else that they are living under false consciousness and whatnot, right? People have to come to it themselves to see, but sometimes there can be a facilitation of that process. And I think the facilitation can also just be done with a lot of questions. So when I was talking to the 15-year-old girl who was saying, I just have poor self-esteem because I wish I was skinnier and lighter skinned, and me saying, so where did you get those ideas? I wasn't no, that's not true. It's racism, it's sexism right away. Even though in my mind I was saying that. And talking with her, I was asking her questions. Where did you get this image of that? And really asking questions for her to begin to name her world, the systems, the experiences. And both things can be true, right? So that guy who was incarcerated, who said he was not oppressed, he really was having a profound transformative experience, because he was away from the streets and the things that had been really hard and painful for him in his family life and on the streets, and in a place that was quiet, and not quiet at all actually, but away from that, and where he could sort of reflect and meditate and have a little time to transform. And a lot of people inside often say that it has been for many people time to transform. in that way. So it's not untrue that he didn't feel oppressed. He felt completely free for the first time in his life in a very emotional, spiritual way. That doesn't mean that the political circumstances of him being a Latino man in LA and being imprisoned and all the dynamics that got him there and the poverty that he faced in his life and all the root conditions that led to the circumstances of his arrest aren't true. They're both true, right? So it's about really recognizing that multiple truths exist, and how do we work to really understand all the different things and the structures in play and our own personal feelings, and that they all can coexist through curiosity of trying to understand our lived experience and the systemic experience. And I don't think you can ever tell someone else what their false consciousness is, but you can help facilitate conversations that help begin to illuminate things that where they begin to question stuff themselves, and also where they really name what they feel, and that's real in that moment, and that can't be protested, and it also might change over time. We got 3 more minutes, so probably one more question, comment, concern, protest. Keely, did you want to say something? You have to unmute yourself though so we can hear you.
Hi there. Hi, Tessa. Hi, students. Oh, it's so nice to hear everyone speak. The part that I was thinking about was the part that came up about self-care, and the point that you made that people have been taking care of themselves forever. And that it's a primal need to take care of ourselves, not a privilege, a need. And people resource themselves in different ways. But I was thinking of it needs to move up the ladder in this period of time, so that just for myself, so that I can be clear, and so that I can have the stamina and the courage to keep going and to have challenging conversations and to speak my mind and to do any of the other things that I do to take action. I need that self-care on a greater level because it makes me strong. And I think that is a critical piece, because if I don't feel strong, then I'm going to stay small. I'm going to let someone else do the speaking up. And I was thinking about that in this context, and just doing things differently, thinking, coming to a place of acceptance with my social position, and having at my fingertips what I can do, and having the courage to do it. Because one, it can be scary, and two, it's different.
Yes.
Yeah.
And part of that self-care is so that, like you said, to expand our bandwidth for the discomfort that comes with negotiating issues of justice, and also so that we have the strength to fight against it. Yes, both when we're the ones being harmed by the system and when we may be actually complicit in the systems, and yeah, it leads to both of it for sure. And also, I think if we're wanting to fight for a world where well-being is treasured and no one has to deal with the pain and suffering that we're negotiating from these systems, then we have to practice it now, because it's not going to just magically happen in the utopia of our future and if we don't start practicing it now. It's like the rehearsal for revolution. It's also the rehearsal for the world we want. Okay, my friends, it is 12 o'clock, so we have hit our mark for the hour. Thank you all so much for joining, listening to me. I hope it was helpful and interesting. You can get the chapter or listen to the recording if you want any more on this.